Nature isn't just out there in some far-off exotic location. It's all around us, including right outside our doors. Hi, my name is Shannon Trimboli, and I am the host of Backyard Ecology. I invite you to join us as we ignite our curiosity and natural wonder, explore our yards and communities, and improve our local pollinator and wildlife habitat. Hi, everyone. Today we are talking with Mac Callaham, who is a research ecologist with the Southern Research Station of the U.S. Forest Service. Mac's focus is on invasive species with a specialty in soil organisms, especially earthworms. Hi, Mac. Welcome to Backyard Ecology.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for being on here. Let's start out by telling everybody a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, well, as you said in the introduction, I'm a research ecologist with the Southern Research Station, which is a unit of the U.S. Forest Service. And we have a research lab here in Athens, Georgia, on the campus of the University of Georgia. And I've been working here for almost 20 years now, doing mostly research on invasive species and with a specialty in soils, as the listeners will find out, soil animals in particular. But the unit that I work in also concerns itself with other forms of forest disturbance like fire and flood and wind damage, and invasive species is just another in the suite of forest disturbances that we keep ourselves busy studying.
So, the reason I wanted you to be a guest here today is because, like many people, I grew up thinking that earthworms were just a natural part of the environment and that having lots of earthworms in the soil was a good thing. But then as I got older and started studying ecology, started studying wildlife biology, I began to learn about some of the problems and the issues that earthworms are causing up in the Great Lakes region
Mm-hmm.
and about the invasive earthworm problems there. But pretty much everything I was finding, especially back several years ago, was focused on that northern Great Lakes region, the areas that were covered by the glaciers back during the ice ages.
Mm-hmm.
But I live in Kentucky. The glaciers never got down here. So I was never really sure whether the earthworms I saw were normal, natural species, part of the ecosystem, or if they were invasive. And I tried for a while to find out, and I was finding this really conflicting information because some of the sources I was reading was like, there are no native earthworms in North America. And others were saying, no, there's a few species, but I could never figure out what's happening in my soils, what's happening in my region,
Yeah,
much
well,
less.
yeah, it's an interesting, I mean, it is an interesting problem. And I think you were right to wonder about that relationship between glaciers and earthworms. And it's true that, 10,000 years ago, the northern part of the continent was completely covered in a mile thick sheet of ice or more. And even beyond the edge of the glaciers, right, it was still quite cold, and there was this phenomenon known as periglacial ice. So there was permafrost and ice that kind of froze the soils even further south than the terminal margin of those glaciers. And so ice is really bad for earthworms. If you consider that their bodies are about 80% water, being completely frozen is not a good thing for them. So it is true that in those glaciated soils and glacier affected soils, that all of the earthworms that had been there were completely extirpated. But you were also correct to say that, places like the southeastern part of the US and certainly Central America, and there are some areas out in the Pacific, on the Pacific coast, particularly Northern California, Oregon, Washington, that never did experience any freezing from the glaciations. And so those places do still have a pretty rich native earthworm fauna. So we figure there's probably, in terms of actual named species in North America, native named species, it's probably in the neighborhood of maybe 150 species. And those are probably, again, and these are very general numbers, but maybe evenly split between the refugium. So ecologists refer to those unglaciated areas as refugia or refugiums. So the refugium in the southeast, probably half those species are in the refugium in the southeast, and the other half in that refugium in the Pacific Northwest. But we really just don't know very much about a lot of those species. There have not been many, serious taxonomists or systematists working on the earthworm fauna of North America. So we still have a lot of diversity that's undocumented and that needs to be, first collected and then written up and published about. But there's only so much time, you know.
Exactly. Yeah, sounds like something that enterprising grad student needs to think
Yep.
about.
Well, that's, it's funny. I thought that's what I was going to do when I started grad school. I thought I would be a systematist and work out the sort of evolutionary relationships between these worms. But it turns out that I was much more adept at doing ecological type work. And so the systematic work kind of fell to the wayside. But I agree that there's more than one lifetime's worth of work left to be done in that arena. So some enterprising young person probably could.
Finding the funding's always a challenge for
Yeah,
systemic work as well.
that was another issue. Yeah, that was another issue. It turned out that ecological work was easier to get a student assistantship to do. So that's what I ended up doing.
Yes. So that 150 or so species, those are all native species?
Yep, they are. Yeah, and then there's probably, again, these are very rough, kind of round numbers, but probably 30 or 40 species that have been introduced from other continents, mostly Europe and Asia. But there are a few from South America and Africa as well that occur in our soils in North America now. Mostly transported here. Many of them have been here. I've seen some arguments that the very first permanent settlements in North America. So you think about Jamestown and St. John's in maritime Canada and Montreal, those very early settlements, they probably were the places where these earthworms first got introduced, because wherever people go, they have the habit of taking their favorite plants with them, and usually those are brought either in soil or with soil, or there's all kinds of ways that soil gets moved around, and earthworms are almost always in soil when it gets moved. So that's how we got into the mess that we're in now.
Yes. So the native earthworms, what kind of function do they play in the ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean they do earthworm things. So I don't know how much detail we have time to get into here, but when we talk about earthworm ecology, we think about them in terms of kind of their behavioral attributes, and there are generally accepted three different, what we term ecological strategies or ecological types of earthworms. And so the three are: there are those that live right on the surface in leaf litter usually. So these are like mostly forest species, but some even in grassland or mixed type vegetation. They live right on the surface of the soil and they process leaf litter. They basically eat that stuff. They contribute to its decomposition by mixing it in with the first few centimeters of soil. And they rarely, if ever, go deep into the mineral soil. And so then the second type then are those that do live in mineral soil. And they're generally, so if we want to talk about general characteristics, they're generally a little bit larger. They usually don't have any pigmentation. They don't have any coloration to their skin, and they're slow moving and slow growing, and they eat sort of less high quality organic matter out of the soil. So stuff that's already made its way down into the soil, and microbes and things that live in soil. And then the third type is a special kind of a hybrid type. And these worms build burrows that extend deep into the mineral soil. So they actually inhabit mineral soil, but most of their feeding activity occurs on the surface. So they'll come out to the entrance of their burrow and then grab leaf litter or whatever and pull it back into the surface, right around the surface of the burrow. And they kind of build a little mound, which we call middens. And the stuff that they pull into those middens kind of decomposes. It's almost like a fungus gardening behavior. And so they eat the stuff as it decomposes in their middens. So within the North American fauna, and I have to qualify that most of what I know is about those that occur in the southeastern U.S. I grew up in Georgia, have lived in Georgia, or the southeast anyway, South Carolina, Tennessee, Florida, for most of my life. So I can't speak about those ones that occur out in the Pacific Northwest in terms of what their ecological strategies are, but the ones that live in the Southeast, they primarily belong to that group that lives in mineral soil. So they don't do a lot of leaf litter active, in contact with leaf litter. There are a few exceptions, maybe 4 or 5 species that specialize in living in leaf litter, but those are in very specific habitats. and they're not kind of like generally widespread like some of the European species are that live in leaf litter, for example.
Yeah, most of our listeners are in the eastern US,
Okay,
so
good. Well,
more the area you're
yep,
familiar
that'll
with
help. That'll
than
help some.
yes.
Yeah.
Because that's always so important. And that's why I'm really focusing on the Eastern US, because so much of what you find just Googling on the internet is everywhere and broad in general. And when it gets to ecology, that's not quite the way things
Yep. That's
work
one of
very
my
well.
favorite lines is that if you're talking to an ecologist for very long, you have to sort of time how long it takes for them to get to some kind of version of, well, it depends.
Yes, exactly.
We find that everything depends on exactly where you are and when you're there, kind of thing.
Exactly. So the fact that most of our earthworms in this area are those ones that go into the mineral soil, I would take it that's why we always find, like if you're walking down a trail or something during the spring or fall, you find those earthworm holes with the little circular rounds, rings around them of just stuff.
Yep. Sometimes you'll see that. Those could be ants too. What you described sounds like it might be an ant mound, but yeah, so again, well, here I go. It depends on kind of where you are. So in general, the only places where we really find many native worms anymore are in your more or less undisturbed
Mhm.
habitats. So like for example, here in Georgia, if we were gonna try to find a place where if we dug a hole we would expect to find mostly native species, we'd have to go into, national forest lands and get pretty far off of a road before we could be, we have any expectation of getting mostly native species. So I tell people when I teach classes here in Athens that in Athens Clarke County, which is a small county in Georgia, if you were to go out and dig a hole, there's a 95% chance that you would not get a native species out of that hole because the soils here have such a long history of disturbance. And so it depends on where you are in particular, but for major portions of the Southeast, which have almost everything has been, all the original vegetation has been removed at least once. Those kinds of disturbances tend to make soils more prone to being invaded by the European species. So we really do have, there's a mix for sure, but it's mostly non-native species in any place that's had much disturbance history.
And how long does that disturbance history go back? Because, like, even our national forest and national parks here in the eastern US,
Yep.
almost every single one of them was inhabited at one point.
Yep, that's right. And so, we do find that even when we do work up in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, which is, many people would probably consider that to be one of the most remote places you can go to in the Southeast anyway. We still find European worms in places where we know that there were old farmsteads. The people who lived there prior to it becoming a national park were definitely involved in farming, and they were trading plants around, and we still find non-native worms up there quite a bit.
Well, what happens when those non-native earthworms get into the environment?
So the way we have it kind of worked out, at least in theory, is that there is a disturbance to the soil, like a fairly profound disturbance to the local soil, which knocks back the native worms. They don't tolerate disturbance like plowing or vegetation clearing or things like this. They don't tolerate that very well. And so what that results in is kind of open niche space for earthworms to come in and occupy. And so because these European worms have been moving around with European people for centuries or millennia even, they have a leg up, so to speak, even though they don't have legs. They have a leg up on moving into earthworm available space, right? And so they just get established, and then because they're there and established, they more or less prevent the native worms from being able to come back. But having said that, I mean, it's true that most places there's a mix of native and non-native worms. It's pretty rare to find one that is all one or the other. However, the European worms do dominate most soils that are kind of in urban areas or places like that.
So we've been talking about non-native, non-native and native species. I'm much more familiar with plants, birds, mammals, some of the different pollinators and stuff like that than I am about earthworms. But kind of going by what I know from these other taxa, usually you have ones that you have your native species, then you have kind of non-native species that they fit in, they kind of just coexist, really don't seem to be causing too much trouble. And then you have the invasive species. Is that similar with earthworms?
Yeah. Well, so we kind of hinted around at it earlier, and I got off, I got sidetracked, which is bound to happen. So yeah, when you asked me, so what do the non-native worms do? And I said they do earthworm things, right? That's true, but it's also true that, as I was trying to get around to in my circular way, the worms that live in leaf litter, we don't have very many of those represented in our native North American fauna. There's just not many of them. And so when you get an invasive species or a non-native species that moves in that does live in leaf litter, for example, then that is an ecological function, that processing of leaf litter and surface organic matter that really doesn't, there's no native animal equivalent that does that. The closest thing we have is millipedes, and they have a much different, eating and mode of living than earthworms do, right? They don't do nearly as much mixing. So what you do see when you get these litter-dwelling worms that move in, you'll see, there are certain places and certain species. There's an Asian species that my colleagues and I have been, a group of Asian species that my colleagues and I have been doing research on, where, there are places where their abundances are so high that when you walk through the woods by, say like July, all of the leaf litter has disappeared from the surface of the soil. They're just voracious. And this is usually, in places where they've just gotten started and they're really working their way through the available resources. Their populations could go through the roof. So, obviously that kind of activity is a pretty profound disturbance to the ecosystem of the forest floor, right? Mm-hmm. So there's lots of animals and invertebrate and vertebrate animals that live in and need leaf litter layers for their habitat. And so that's been one of the biggest concerns with these non-native species of earthworms moving in, is that they're destroying habitat for salamanders and certain other, herpetofauna, snakes and toads and salamanders and things like that. And they alter the habitat for all of the whole other suite of organisms that live in leaf litter. And so one of the things that we kind of did some research on a few years back was looking at how these Asian invasive earthworms influence habitat for millipedes, again, in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. We found that there was a negative relationship between invasion and millipede diversity and millipede abundance. And so that, it's a little bit of a cause for alarm in terms of kind of our biodiversity resources and natural history resources anywhere these worms get established.
Yeah, I can see how that would be true, because not only do you have those direct effects with, like you said, the millipedes, the salamanders and all that stuff, and those are more charismatic critters, but then you look at all the little bugs and stuff that just everybody kind of, they're bugs, but those are what the Carolina wrens go after, flipping off the leaves and looking.
And they're so numerous too. All those little things that people don't think about, that, if you could shrink yourself down to the size of, say a millipede or whatever, it would be a whole other world to look at in terms of the numbers and diversity of creatures that live in that context. It's just it's one of the things that has kept me interested in soil ecology for 25 years now. Is, we take samples and then we extract them in the lab, and we're talking about things that are, less than 1 millimeter in size, and they just come out by the thousands out of a cup full of soil, say. And the diversity and abundance is just mind-blowing. It still blows my mind, even though I've been doing it for all this time.
Yeah. So you were talking about, as your invasive earthworm population, is it just the invasive species or is it any non-native?
Yeah, so that's an important distinction, I guess, to make, is that, some of these non-native species have been here for literally centuries at this point, since the 1600s at least. And so, we kind of, if they're invasive, they probably were invasive at one point, obviously, because they've spread over most of the continent at this point. But most ecologists think about things as either being naturalized, right? So like the dandelion, for example, is a plant that I'm sure you and many of your listeners are familiar with, right? Not native to North America, but they occur literally everywhere. And the invasion is done, right? They're finished invading. So those are naturalized species, right? So they're certainly naturalized species of earthworms, but there are, and importantly, in places like around the Great Lakes and further north in the U.S. and in Canada in particular, places where there really aren't any earthworms at all because of the glacial history. In the eastern part of the state, it could be naturalized. But when it moves out into those other places where they haven't reached yet, then they are properly termed invasive, right? And they're doing things that can dramatically alter not just the structure of the forest floor, but also, really important things like nutrient relationships. And, around the Great Lakes, some of the things that you hear about that's the most alarming is that leaf litter layer takes a century to develop to the point that it does, right? A big, thick, spongy leaf litter layer. And when they get in there, they eat it down to nothing, and it collapses. And the roots that were growing through that and being insulated by it are now exposed to extreme cold, and that can be a serious problem for overall forest health. So there's kind of a cascade of effects that happens when they move into places where they hadn't been before. So we don't see dramatic effects like that in the southeastern forests because we don't get those big thick leaf litter layers for a couple of reasons. One is that we have native earthworms that are processing some of that material, although I know I've said that we don't have any litter processing ones, but it's also warmer and wetter, maybe not wetter, but definitely warmer down here. So decomposition just goes faster. Nothing really sticks around for more than 5 years or so on a forest floor in the southeast. So nevertheless, we do think that there are certain species that are causing significant issues in terms of biodiversity and nutrient relationships and organic matter cycling and all these things.
Yeah, that's another one of those areas where the impacts are going to depend on where you're at.
Yeah, it really does. Yeah. And most scientists are, well, I don't know about most, many scientists are kind of, at least in my case and many of the people I know and work with, it's hard to get a straight answer out of a scientist because they don't want to say something that hasn't been tested yet, for one thing. And then for another, it really does often depend on conditions. So how bad an invasion is going to be can depend on what species you're talking about, what kind of vegetation is being invaded, what kind of soils are being invaded, what the weather is going to be like for the next 10 years. And, all these things can really play into what the ultimate outcome of something like that's going to be. So, yeah, it's just an appreciation for the complexity, I think, is what can be boiled down into that. It depends.
Exactly. So you've mentioned the Smoky Mountains, and like you said, a lot of people think of it as pretty remote, pretty pristine, but I was looking through some of the literature and it looked like you had done work in DC as well. So what are some of the differences that we're seeing between these more rural areas and maybe even breaking rural down into those more what we think of as more natural areas than kind of more agricultural areas, suburban, urban? Is there a gradient that we're seeing? Or
so that DC project was really an interesting one, and that was in collaboration with the National Park Service. So I don't know how much the listeners are familiar with that area, but there is a park that's called the George Washington Memorial Parkway in Washington DC, and it runs essentially from Arlington Cemetery. Arlington's kind of right there in the center of the parkway, and it runs to the south down to Mount Vernon, where Washington had made his home, and then it runs to the north all the way up to Great Falls Park. And so it's kind of like a string of parks along a highway, kind of runs up and down, runs north to south on the western side of the district. So what we did was we sampled from Arlington Cemetery, which is essentially right in downtown, but had been undisturbed since Civil War times. And then we sampled along the string of parks that goes along the parkway from essentially right downtown DC, or almost downtown DC. We had planes from Washington or Reagan National Airport going over us as they were coming in for a landing at one of our sampling sites. That was pretty intense. So we sampled basically from the middle of DC all the way up to Great Falls, which is a pretty rural setting. It's a fairly good sized park of at least a few hundred acres. And again, it's a place that had kind of been set aside for more than a century. And our intent was to sample from, urban soils that we knew were disturbed and had been recently disturbed, and all the way out to these places that were what we consider to be fairly long-term undisturbed soils, right? And so one of the things that we found was that indeed, as we got further out, and particularly at Great Falls, we started to collect more and more of the native species of earthworms. But what we didn't expect, and that happened when we were sampling this was right next to, trying to think the exact location, but it was very, very close to Reagan National Airport on the Potomac there. And we collected a species of earthworm that had not been reported in North America before. So a new introduction, basically. And so my colleagues in that group had also, just in the last year or two, had reported on another species that had never been reported in North America before. So the upshot here is that, if you're sampling in urban centers where there's lots of international commerce and interstate commerce as well, those are the kinds of places, those urban centers are the kinds of places where you're likely to find new introductions. And so we went from, in the rural end of that spectrum, we found mostly native species, a mix, but there were some non-native species in there too. But some native species, but in DC proper, no native species and new species of introduced earthworm fauna. So those are the kinds of patterns that, that's one example. But I would expect that those kinds of patterns to be borne out if we did it in any major urban center across the eastern seaboard.
Yeah, and it kind of makes sense based on what we've seen with other organisms as well. I'm thinking like the plants and stuff, like
Sure.
invasive plants and stuff.
Yeah, almost all your invasive species, be they, plant or insect or invertebrate or whatever, you find them in major ports in the east. So I think about, there's other examples of soil invasive species like the fire ant, for example. And fire ants were introduced in Mobile Bay at the port of Mobile, and they've slowly worked their way out. I don't know if they're in Kentucky yet, but we're covered up in them here in Georgia for sure.
Yeah, there's an occasional one, I think, has been found once. Nest has been found once or twice. Far western Kentucky, never made it anywhere. So we really don't have them yet.
Yeah, well, good. And I hope you never have to. They're a bit of a pain.
Yeah, I've been in Kentucky most of my life, but have also, like you, spent some time in other southern states. I've got family in Georgia, family in Alabama. Yeah, I've had my fair share of fire ants. And
you know about fire ants.
Oh, yeah.
But so anyway, the point there is that these ports, where all this material is coming from all over the world, that's where most of these invasive species kind of get a toehold, and then they get moved around in soil and by whatever other means they get moved. So it's ongoing. I think a lot of people have the inaccurate perspective that everything that's going to get moved and introduced has already been moved and introduced, but it's just not true.
Right. And that's a good point too, because I agree with you. I think people tend to think that a lot of times, and it's so not true.
Yeah, it's true that a lot of them are already here, but there are more coming, and we don't know which one is going to be the next fire ant or, whatever major economic problem or public health issue that it might be. So
Exactly. So is there anything else about your research you want to share with us?
In terms of kind of ecological relationships, we did a study with a graduate student here not too long ago who was kind of piggybacking on another study. And this one would be interesting to you because it was about the effects of removing an invasive plant, Chinese privet. This is a plant that lives primarily in, river bottom forest, kind of a bottomland forest species. And when it gets established, it becomes the only species of plant that lives in these, it kind of forms a very dense thicket. It's a shrub that can get, 15 or 20 feet high and forms a really dense monoculture thicket. And so this guy, Jim Hanula is his name, was interested in finding out what would happen if we removed that privet and did some fairly aggressive comparison methods of how to get rid of the privet, including cutting it down with chainsaws. And then he had another treatment where he was grinding it up with a mechanical, like a front end loader type thing or a front mounted tractor thing. And so, that study had been going on for 4 or 5 years, and then they said, well, hey, what do you think about maybe looking and seeing what's happening in the soils under these different removal treatments? And so we did that. We put together a study for a student to go and sample for earthworms and other things in these privet removal plots. And so the interesting thing that happened in the earthworm community was that we found that when you removed the Chinese privet, there was one species of European earthworm that was really reduced in number. So there was apparently some kind of a relationship between the invasive plant and the non-native worm that was synergistic, is a term that we would use for that, right? So they seem to get along real well with each other. And so when you remove one, the other one kind of dropped out. But what we were more excited about was that one of our native species that also lives in these bottomland soils, their numbers went up when we removed the Chinese privet. And so we thought that was a really cool result and a good argument that you can improve conditions for lots of things. And it was borne out in terms of bird diversity and bird use of these forests. It was borne out in pollinator diversity and abundance. And when you remove that invasive plant, then you get a boom of biological diversity in response to that, both above ground and below ground. And we thought that was a really cool result.
Yeah, that is.
It was not true for all of the invasives or the non-native worm species, right? So not all of them were negatively impacted by removing the privet, but that one was, and it was a dominant species. So it resulted in a wholesale change in our perspective for the better of the below ground community just by removing that one plant species.
Yeah, and I would.
So that was kind of another cool little study that we did looking at earthworms. So I'll tell you, there's a whole lifetime of work to be done on these questions and trying to, a lot of what I've done is looking to see if I can detect patterns. And we've done a lot of that. We've detected a lot of patterns, but we have not, if I were my own worst critic, I would say, haven't done a great job of identifying what the mechanisms behind those patterns are. And so that's what'll keep me busy for the next 10 or 15 years, I guess.
Well, that's the other thing about science is that every time you think you get an answer, it usually leads to more questions. There isn't ever an end.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's the open-ended nature of it is one of the things that makes it so much fun to do as a career. You never, unless you're not a good scientist, I guess, you never run out of questions. You're never going to run out of questions. Right. So, yep, that's good.
Yeah. And what you were talking about with one species of non-native declining and one of the native species increasing, I mean, that sounds like a win right there, even if it wasn't true of all non-natives, as long as...
Yeah, anything you can do to encourage the native diversity, I think is, as you say, a win for sure. Yeah, we were pretty excited about that.
Yeah, that is exciting.
Yeah.
So this is a question I'm almost afraid to bring up and to ask.
Because I'm going to ramble for another 40 minutes.
Oh, no, I'm perfectly fine with rambling for 40 minutes. I'll stay on and talk to you about this for as long as you want to.
Okay.
Getting into the application. So if we know that we've got some of these non-native invasive species, and for most of the eastern U.S., we've got them, pretty much is what I'm hearing.
We do.
A couple of years ago, I guess it was, I started finding, instead of just like the little normal earthworms that I've seen all my life in Kentucky and the Southeast and stuff, I started finding around our place some of these giant earthworms. Mm-hmm. And if you grabbed them, they would like thrash around and everything.
Yeah, like little snakes.
Yes, exactly.
Yep. Those are those Asian worms that I've been referring to a little bit off and on. Yeah.
Yes, that's what I was afraid they were.
So in Kentucky, I've heard people call them wood eels because they move like an eel.
Oh, I hadn't heard that one.
Yeah, that may be an eastern Kentucky thing, but kind of in the mountains area over there. But it's one of my favorite. There's scientific names and then there's common names, and the common names are almost always more creative and evocative than the scientific names are.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah, I love that one, wood eels.
Yeah.
Some people call them snake worms. Some people call them jumping worms. The Alabama jumper, you hear people say sometimes, because it's true, if you kind of poke at them a little bit, they will, twist and thrash, and they can throw themselves up off the ground. And yeah, they're something. You've seen one when you've seen one, for sure.
Yeah, exactly. They just kind of appeared.
Yeah.
And trying to find information about them, and because I knew when I saw them, like you said, you know what you've got when you find it.
Mm-hmm.
If you've heard anything about them, you know it. But I've read horror stories of them completely destroying the soil structure, turning into basically coffee ground type structure, and then all mineral soil, no nutrients in it. I've seen pictures of areas where they've gone through and it's like green vegetation before, and then the next year after they've been discovered, nothing on the forest floor growing.
Yeah, so those are the ones that I was talking about when I say that, when they reach really high numbers, you can walk through an area and when you get into them because the leaf litter it's just gone. It's been completely consumed. So yeah, it's true that those worms do have a fairly profound influence on the surface of the soil and soil structure and nutrient relationships and everything. I'll be the voice of moderation here. Maybe I'm not going to be an alarmist for sure. I think that those profound effects are probably just transient, and they represent. So a lot of invasions they occur in waves, right? So you've got an uninvaded area, and then the invasive species moves in, and there's tons of the resource that they like to exploit, and they reach really high population numbers. And then eventually they exploit all the resources that are available, and then their population falls back to a more reasonable carrying capacity type level, right? So you see that population hump in lots of invasions where they're super abundant for a while and then they kind of drop back to a more manageable or reasonable level. So I think that that's probably happens with these worms too, that they'll have those profound effects in the short term, but that eventually that'll kind of balance out and it won't be quite as catastrophic as it appears it's going to be to begin with.
Good, because I was kind of getting at my question is there anything that we as homeowners, property owners can do if we start seeing these invasive earthworms, or do we just kind of kiss our natural areas goodbye at that point?
Well, I mean, again, I think that, there will be a profound effect to begin with, but that'll moderate in later years. In terms of being able to actually manage the populations or trying to get rid of them, in more natural settings, we've actually kind of toyed around with the idea of using prescribed fire as a way to control them, because we did a little study at one point where we did that. We introduced these worms into some test beds and let them do their thing for a few weeks, and then lit the leaf litter that we had put in there. We tried to simulate a forest floor in these test beds, lit that on fire, and then sampled to see what happened with the earthworms. And it turned out that the fire actually did, we observed some direct mortality, and we also collected the cocoons that they had produced, and we learned that if the cocoons were exposed to even a little bit of heat, they ended up not hatching at as high a rate as the ones that weren't exposed to heat. So we think that, and then finally, the next year when those worms hatch, if that area has been burned, then there won't be any food for the hatchlings to eat because it's been burned up in the fire, right? And we know that fires does a lot of things, both in terms of plant ecology and other things too, but it's not like applying fire to these forests is going to be a bad thing from an ecological perspective. And it might be a good thing in terms of the invasive earthworm control. But your average homeowner is not going to be able to set their backyard on fire, right? So for the homeowner, I don't have much guidance. I know that there are some products that are available that, I don't know if they're being marketed as wormicides, but there are some things that are effective in that arena. And I think even some organic options. I'm not really at liberty to endorse any particular product or anything, but you should be able to.
But there's options.
You should be able to find them, if you're really concerned.
Is it something that we need?
But I mean, you run the risk if you do that. You run the risk of prolonging the invasion phase. In my mind, it's something that you just pretty much have to accept is going to happen and try to get it over with. But the other thing that I would say is that if you want to prevent an invasion from happening in the first place, you'd be really selective about the kinds of things that you add to your own garden. I know it's happened in my own personal gardening experience. As we planted some blueberry bushes in the backyard of our most recent house. when I brought the blueberry bushes in containers to my yard, there were these Asian worms in the root balls of those containers, those blueberry bushes. And so I'm like, okay, I guess we have them now. But I did do what I could to pick them out and make sure that they didn't get established in my yard. And so you can do things like that and just be really, really careful about moving plants and soil around is about the best you can do. So yeah, we're hoping we can protect some more natural areas that are big enough and remote enough that we can actually use prescribed fire as a management tool for these worms. But in the homeowner realm, I don't have a lot of guidance for how to manage them. Sorry to say.
Yeah, no, but that makes sense. It does. Picking out what you find, being careful about where you get things and what you're bringing in.
Yeah. And if you feel like it's a real problem, then you can probably look for some pesticidal type things that might work on them. And I would encourage you to contact your county extension agent for guidance on those kinds of things.
That's what I was going to say. Probably extension agents, where to go. Oh yeah, I love working with the extension agents. They're awesome.
Yeah, they're a vast wealth of knowledge. Yes. Those folks. They're not going to point you in the wrong direction most of the time.
Exactly. So if you had one takeaway message that you'd want the listeners to remember, what would it be?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I tend to be optimistic about earthworms, both native and non-native. I think that, especially for places where there is a long history of soil degradation, like we have across much of the Piedmont, for example, the Piedmont region, where all the cotton agriculture happened back 150, 200 years ago, 100 years ago. I still pretty much hold that any worm is a good worm, and that earthworms are doing generally good things for soil productivity. It's when you get it. So, for example, in my backyard, if I find some worms and they're in my garden, and then there's a really good chance that they're improving conditions because that soil was so degraded by cotton agriculture 100 years ago, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that in that case, a worm is a worm is a worm in frank terms, right? Mm-hmm. They're probably doing good things. But that in more natural settings, like a forest reserve or, someplace that's a little bit more remote, then I tend to get a little bit less sanguine and optimistic about invasive worms. And I think that we should try to do what we can to come up with management strategies that both promote native species, native diversity, native soil ecosystem function, and that will deter invasion.
Yeah.
So I don't know how that is for a take-home message, but...
No, I like it. And I like the fact that you addressed garden situations directly because, so often we still hear, put worms in your garden. Worms are great for the garden, all this other stuff. And so that's where I was starting to wonder, okay, well, what about garden settings? Or is this something that we need to be concerned about?
But... Yeah. Well, so as I said, I feel like to a large extent for most of the species that we're talking about, and I know I'm giving kind of a bit of a mixed message here, but most of these species have been here for centuries. And, I would say that for the first, 120 years or 100 years that people were doing serious earthworm ecology, which started with Charles Darwin. I don't know if you knew that. He wrote a book. The last book that Darwin published was about earthworms and their activities.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, you should look it up. All the listeners should look it up. It's called something like this. It's on the formation of vegetable mold through the action of earthworms. He spent the last 40 years of his life in southern England, living in a place called Down House. And he just devoted himself to, he had a greenhouse full of orchids. And so he wrote a book about orchids, orchid biology, and he made observations about earthworms, and he wrote a book about that. And he's a really remarkable naturalist, in addition to being the father of modern biology, I guess. So anyway, from that time until fairly recently, most of what we thought about and studied on earthworms was, their beneficial effects as soil organisms, right? They do all kinds of good things. They aerate the soil, they improve water infiltration, they speed up nutrient cycling, so they make nutrients available to plants that would otherwise be tied up in other pools. And all of this was well known and documented in the scientific literature. And then all of a sudden, say maybe 20 years ago, we started to realize that not all these worms are native, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's also true that most of that work was being done in agricultural settings, right, where you care about soil quality and nutrient availability to the crop plants and these kinds of things. So it's only recently that we've really started to realize that, these worms that are getting out into natural settings are not really necessarily all that great for what we would consider to be natural native function of those systems, right?
Right.
But I would say in an agricultural situation or your home vegetable garden, most of the time worms are going to be doing things that are beneficial to your plants and your soil. So it's kind of a double-edged sword, I guess you would say.
Yeah, and it makes sense because we manage our built landscapes differently than we manage our more natural landscapes. I mean, that's just with anything we do.
Yeah. And so it's where those two things butt up against each other that are the most concerning for people like me, right? So if your listeners, if any of your listeners have a summer house or a vacation house or a cabin or something that is up in the woods in a remote place, I would say please don't take plant out of your urban garden like let's say a hosta, for example, or something that you would transplant with soil in a root ball, right?
Right.
Just don't do that. There's no reason to, right? Why make the two places more similar? So, those are the kinds of things that I advise is just if you have access or you're a frequent visitor to a more remote place, for goodness sake, don't take, your stuff from urban settings and move it out there, especially, soil and plants and those kinds of things.
Yeah.
Try to keep that line between the two kinds of habitat more distinct, I guess, is what I would say.
Yeah. So if people wanted to learn more about earthworms and what they do in the environment, whether that's the more natural environments or learning more about invasive earthworms and the home environments and stuff, where would you suggest they go?
There's a few resources. So, for the Great Lakes folks, there is a group at University of Minnesota they've done a tremendous amount of really good work on earthworm invasions. And they're working in places where it is a serious, profound issue. And they've got an organization called the Great Lakes Worm Watch. And I can provide you with links for that. And so they have a lot of resources, including ways to identify what species you have and kind of what you can expect. And maybe I don't know if they have any control things either. But so there's that group. There are a group in Kansas, which I was a part of, that did a statewide survey of earthworms in Kansas called Earthworms Across Kansas, creatively enough. They've got a really cool website which shows you can go kind of county by county. So what they did was they sent out collecting kits to every school in the state. And so school kids went out and collected worms and then sent them back to the lab at Kansas State, who was in the head of the thing. They produced a great map of earthworm distribution, sort of species diversity, and it was kind of an unprecedented level of detail that they developed. So that's one for Kansas.
That's really cool. I like that methodology.
And then, of course, there's the old-fashioned way, which is go to the library, and there's a few books that are particularly good. There's one that was edited by a guy here at UGA, University of Georgia in Athens, named Paul Hendricks, and that one is called Ecology and Biogeography of Earthworms in North America. And that is kind of that's the gold standard for the current state of the knowledge, although it's 25 years old now, but still stands as, kind of the reference for earthworm ecology in North America.
Good to know. Thank you.
Yep.
Anything else you want to share with us?
I don't know. If you can think of any other questions, feel free to get in touch with me. And of course, your listeners are free to get in touch as well. I consider that as a federal scientist, it's taxpayers that pay my salary. So I'm more than happy to try to field any questions and help folks out if they have anything specific that they want to follow up on.
That's great. And I'm assuming that some of this research that you've been talking about is also on some of the USDA pages.
Yeah, all of that should be on the Southern Research Station website. And if not, then Google Scholar is a good place to go to look for any of those things. I think you could probably just type in earthworm invasion or something like that in Google Scholar, and you'd get more than you'd ever want to read about these issues.
Yes. When I started this podcast, I knew from what I'd been hearing about earthworms, and especially with the jumping earthworms coming through, I wanted to do something with earthworms. And so started looking for who was doing the recent research. And that's what really led me to you.
There's a handful of us. So myself and my colleague Bruce Snyder, who is down at Georgia College in Milledgeville, Georgia, is another really active researcher in that arena. Told you about the group at Minnesota that's led by a guy named Lee Freilich and his colleagues, Cindy Hale and a number of others. And then there's a group in New York at, I can't think of it right now, but so there's a few of us scattered out. There's some in Vermont. There's a guy named Joseph Goris who's studying these worms in Vermont. Again, the Asian worms in particular. Really great group at Johns Hopkins University, led by Kathy Slavitz. So yeah, we've got a few people who are on the case and trying to figure out what's going on. So yeah, there's plenty of expertise out there.
That's good to know. And I like the fact that you mentioned several from other areas too, because I'm assuming up in Vermont, what their situation is going to be very different than down here. And
yep, that's right. Yeah, so that glaciated area, the earthworm invasions it's a whole other ball of wax for forests and any kind of habitat up there where those worms get established, because they were worm free until recently, relatively recently anyway. So I think that that's where you're going to hear most of the alarm bells. But it is an issue here in the Southeast as well. And like you say, it's very dependent on where you are and kind of the whole situation. So we're working our way towards trying to figure it out, and in particular, maybe some management strategies that can be applied. So containment and management.
This has been great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, well, thank you. As I said, I could probably talk all day about earthworms, so we can cut it off whenever you're ready. But yeah, this has been a real pleasure for me.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think this really is a good introduction.
Yeah.
At least we don't want to overwhelm everybody.
Yeah, that's right. Well, there's a lot to be learned yet, but a lot already known. So
right.
Just if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask. You can either go through Shannon, or you can go through me, or however you want to do it. I'm available.
Well, thanks again. Thanks so much for that.
Sure thing.
This has been interesting. I've learned a lot myself.
Great.
All right. Well, thanks a lot again.
Okie doke.
All right. Thanks. Bye. I appreciate Mac taking the time to share his knowledge with us. As I said in the beginning of our conversation, I grew up thinking that earthworms were a natural part of the ecosystem and were a sign of good soil health. However, later on, I learned that this wasn't completely true. Earthworms aren't a natural part of the ecosystem in many parts of the continent, and they can have devastating impacts in those areas. Even in more southern regions, like where I live, we may have some species of native earthworms, but many of the ones that I'm used to finding probably aren't native. In those parts of the country, whether the earthworms are good, bad, or neutral depends a lot on the species, the location, and the land use. This really is a complicated topic with no easy answer that applies to everyone, everywhere. Talking with Mac helped me gain a better understanding of the situation, and I hope it helped you too. I put all kinds of links in the show notes if you want to learn more about this subject. Before I wrap this up, I want to let you know that I also write a weekly backyard ecology blog. If you are enjoying these podcast episodes, then you might also want to check out my blog. The easiest way to find my blog is to visit my website at www.backyardecology.net. Until next week, I encourage you to take some time to enjoy the nature in your own yard and community.